You all are the beneficiaries of the fact that I gave a talk earlier today on pretty much the same subject, so I hopefully worked out some of the kinks in my presentation. So, as the introduction said, I work for the ACLU of Michigan. When I was hired in December of 13, it was really an experiment because no other ACLU had hired someone like me. And part of the reason they were able to do so when in the grant application, they talked about how mainstream media is cutting back on investigative reporting. And so by hiring me, it was an attempt to help fill the void that's been left by those cutbacks. And, since this is a group of journalists here, so I'm breaking new ground here. And I think that there's probably a legitimate debate as to whether I'm really a journalist or not. I work for an advocacy organization. Nonprofit journalism is definitely a force now with, Mother Jones has been around for a long time, ProPublica and Center for Public Integrity. But the difference between them and me is that they are nonprofits, but they are strictly news organizations. I work for an advocacy organization with a clear agenda. But I come out of the alternative press, worked for papers that were openly liberal, and so the transition was not like leaping a chasm for me. And the bottom line has always been, even though my politics or whatever might compel me to pursue a story, once an investigation is launched, the cards fall where the cards fall, because you all know that credibility is fundamental to being a journalist. If you have to be accurate and you have to tell the truth, and if you don't do those things, then no matter where you work for, you're not worth anything. And so that's the mindset that I brought with me when I made the move to the ACLU. And I was hired with the specific intent of investigating and reporting on Michigan's emergency manager law. And that doesn't have anything to do with hurricanes or earthquakes or natural disasters. Michigan has the most extreme receivership law in the country. Financially struggling school districts, cities, counties, if they are at risk of insolvency, this law allows the governor to appoint a so-called emergency manager who has complete authority. They can break collective bargaining agreements, they can sell off assets, they can create new ordinances, break existing ordinances. The one thing that the law says that they cannot do, and the only thing the law says that they cannot do, is miss a bond payment. So the banks get paid no matter what. And elected officials, city councils, school boards, boards of supervisors, can still be elected to office, they can still meet, they can still vote on things. But if the emergency manager does not agree with what they decide, they can overrule it. And so essentially, these towns, and the towns almost across the board, are majority African American and very poor. Flint, Michigan is no different, has a poverty rate of about 40%. And so they were taken over in 2011. A series of emergency managers were put in place in 2014 in an attempt to save $5 million while a new pipeline was being built. One of these emergency managers made the unilateral decision to save $5 million by removing Flint from the Detroit regional system that had been providing clean, safe water for 50 years in favor of going to the Flint River. Flint is the birthplace of General Motors, and the Flint River was sometimes referred to as the GM sewer because of all the industrial waste that was put into it. Along with being dirty, it turned out also to be highly corrosive. The water treatment plant in Flint was totally unprepared for the difficult, complicated task of treating the Flint River. Up until that point, they had gotten treated water from Detroit, would come in, they would add some chlorine to it and send it on its way. Went from that to having to treat the river water, which changes all the time. If it rains a lot, it changes. If it doesn't rain too much, it changes. In the spring, when the snow melts and the salt that they put on the roads to melt the ice, that gets into it, that changes the composition of the river. And they were just totally unprepared. Immediately after the switchover, people complained about the water didn't smell good, it didn't look good, it didn't taste good. Within a matter of months, there were E. coli contamination. They reacted to that by upping the amount of chlorine. By upping the amount of chlorine, it created a carcinogenic byproduct of chlorine called total trihalomethanes, which elevated levels of that were in the water for about 9 months before the city and state informed the people of that. They told them that in January of 15, which is when I started going up to Flint to start looking into what was going on. First meeting I went to was just about a year ago, and people were confronting the emergency manager saying, you know, why didn't you tell us about this TTHMs being in our water? And the emergency manager said, as soon as we found out about it, we started to address the problem. Yeah, but that's not telling us. As soon as we found out about it, we started to address the problem. Yeah, but that's not telling us. Well, I'm telling you now. And it was just such a callous, the whole tone just showed such disregard for these people that he was supposed to be there serving, but he had no connection to the community. He wasn't from the community. He's like a hired gun that's brought in and supposedly to clean things up. He had no reason to care what those people thought because they could not remove him from office the way it works in a normal democracy. So that was sort of a crystallized things for me in that moment, and thought, man, we really got to look into this. And so I started meeting with residents, did a short documentary. I teamed up with this young, very talented filmmaker named Kate Levy, and we produced a short documentary talking about the connections between emergency management, the frustrations people were feeling, what they were going through physically. I mean, people's hair was falling out in clumps. They were getting these strange rashes that dermatologists couldn't diagnose or treat. Other things were going on. And so they were very frustrated with their situation, angry, upset. We did a short documentary, only about 6 minutes long, and published that, released it toward the end of June in 15. At the same time, there was a water expert working for the US EPA named Miguel Del Toro, who was really the unsung hero in all of this. He was working with one of the residents, a mom by the name of Leanne Walders, who had her kid, one of her kids tested for lead and found that the kid had elevated levels of lead in his blood. He had been lead poisoned. And she became fiercely determined to get to the bottom of what was going on. She searched around till she found Del Toro, who was the one public official in all this that actually did his job and cared about what was happening to the people that he was being paid to serve. He connected Leanne with Mark Edwards, who is an environmental engineering professor, civil engineering professor at Virginia Tech, and is the person who uncovered the lead problem in Washington, D.C.'s water in the early 2000s. Mark sent a sample kit to Leanne, walked her through gathering samples. It took about 30 samples because water, the way they do these samples, water when it's moving through a system is not like a stream where it flows. It sort of moves through all together into what they call slugs. And so if you time it, you can find out exactly where in the system a particular sample comes from. And so there's a range of findings when they analyzed the water, but the worst one had lead levels of 13,200 parts per billion. And to put that in perspective, the federal action level is 15 parts per billion. Water is classified as hazardous waste if it has 5,000 parts per billion lead in it. So 2.5 times the level of what it takes to be classified as hazardous waste they were drinking. Del Toro took that information, looked at what was going on in terms of the science, because one of the things that Leanne had found by talking to employees at the water treatment plant was that mandatory corrosion control was not being added to the water. So they went from the safe, low corrosive Detroit water that had corrosion control being added to it, and for some reason it's still not really well explained. The Flint River, which is many times more corrosive, the state decided to stop adding the corrosion control. And the river water had very high salt content, and that just started tearing up the pipes. And that's why the people's water was discolored from the iron pipes. Rust was being dislodged and getting into the water. What they didn't see was the lead particles that were also getting in there. Del Toro, having been a long-time EPA employee, was worried about the memo would get watered down and buried in the bureaucracy. So he gave a copy of that memo to Leanne. Because our documentary took seriously the concerns that people were expressing, didn't blow them off like some of the local media was doing, was just calling them, crazy moms that were, overreacting to concerns about the water. We took them seriously. Because of that, we were the ones that she shared that memo with. We published it. I wrote a story about it. And the MDEQ completely blew me off. They wouldn't respond to any of my questions. Subsequent emails that were obtained talking about the exchange, at one point they said, oh, that reporter, and they put quotes around the word reporter, from the ACLU, this must be what he was been trying to talk to us about, because after I published it, the one mainstream media outlet, Michigan Public Radio, picked up the story and ran with it. They interviewed the Michigan Department of Environmental Quality. The chief spokesman there responded by saying, when it comes to lead in people's water, people of Flint can just relax. There's no overall problem with lead in their water. So at that point, what I had was he said, she said kind of story. The Del Toro was classified as a rogue employee who, didn't have the memo properly vetted and, went wild and just, released it to this crazy mom. And, then the ACLU, those radicals over there, irresponsibly published that memo, and but there's really nothing to worry about. So how do you get to the truth? And I came up with the idea of doing our own test. I talked to Mark Edwards. He applied for a National Science Foundation grant that paid for 300 water sampling kits to be sent to Flint. Talked to the residents, helped them organize the sampling. We distributed 200 kits. When we did that, we sat down and mapped out where they had all been distributed to, and then went out and started knocking on doors where areas that we were light on in order to make sure that we were covering the whole city in as a responsible way as possible, because we knew that we were going to get attacked when our results were released. And at the same time, I conducted a parallel investigation, filing Freedom of Information Act requests, going out and knocking on doors myself to find out how it was that the city and state were able to claim that the water was safe and met federal clean water standards. And what I found out was that they were cheating. They were cheating by finding loopholes in the law and exploiting them. and they were cheating by not following the law at all. They were supposed to be verifying that every home tested had either a lead service line or lead plumbing, because the intent of the law is to look for lead where it's most likely to exist. Moreover, when the Michigan Department of Environmental Quality started to analyze the lead tests that the city of Flint was providing them, they sent a memo saying, man, a lot of those tests are coming in over the action level. If any more comes in, you're going to be out of compliance. So you better hope no more tests come in over the action level. The next 30 tests that they did all came in under the action level. One of the reasons that was able to happen is because they targeted parts of the city that they knew would produce low results. So instead of doing what they were supposed to be doing and looking for lead where it was most likely to exist, they went looking where they knew it was not going to exist. And I was able to prove that through documents that I obtained through the Freedom of Information Act request. This was going on in August. September, we hold a press conference. Edwards comes from Virginia Tech, releases the results of the sampling, saying that they were far above the action level. I was at the press conference saying, how do you explain the discrepancy between what Virginia Tech is finding and what the city and state are claiming? And it's, well, because the city and state are cheating. And this needs to be investigated. Outside authority needs to come in and investigate what's going on. Just as it happened with Del Toro, the EPA's response was, or the MDEQ's response was to say, not a problem here. We've done the testing. We're within the federal limits. They tried to discredit Edwards, who is one of the most ethical people I've ever met, absolutely courageous, and takes seriously his obligation as a civil engineer to protect the well-being of people, unlike the people working at the MDEQ and for the city. And the local media covered that, but it was still not getting widespread attention. But because our results were so startling, a pediatrician at Hurley Medical Center in Flint took it upon herself to do a study of herself. What she did was analyze blood samples from kids under 5 years of age, and she compared the 9-month period before the switch to the river to a 9-month period after the switch to the river, and found that after the switch, the percentage of kids with elevated levels of lead in their blood had doubled. And that in the parts of the city that we had found the highest levels of lead in the water, the percentage of kids with elevated lead levels nearly tripled. And so it was pretty conclusive that not only was there lead in the water, lead in the kids' blood, but that it was connected to the decision to switch to the river. And that was a big tipping point. You know, it's one thing to tell people you have lead in your water. It's another thing to tell your people that your kids are being poisoned by lead in their water. And it's devastating. You know, kids that are exposed to elevated levels of lead, they experience IQ loss, they have behavioral problems, learning disabilities, all things that help funnel them into the school to prison pipeline. And, you know, Flint is a place that's struggling regardless. Kids have an uphill battle. Be poisoned by lead and face that is devastating. Even after the Hurley Hospital study, the state tried to attack. They tried attacking the credibility of this doctor, Mona Hanna-Attisha, who was another extraordinary person, very gutsy person, put herself out there to release this under pressure, pretty heavy pressure not to do it. You know, the spokeswoman for the governor said, oh, she spliced and diced her data. You know, slanderous accusation, really, to accuse a researcher of, you know, manipulating their data to come to a certain outcome is slanderous and outrageous. But then the Detroit Free Press analyzed the state's own data and said, guess what, state? Your own data confirms what Hanna-Attisha is saying. And that was really the tipping point then. They could not deny it any longer. The governor was forced to hold a press conference where he announced that Flint would be allowed to return to the Detroit system. The damage to the infrastructure is already immense. Whether they're going to be able to actually keep lead out of the water by using the Detroit water and applying corrosion control as it should be is not known at this point. In the state, there's new revelations now. You know, for a long time, it was pretty much I had the story to myself, which in some ways is, you know, as journalists, you know, is a great position to be in, right? But also we were kind of like hanging out there by ourselves too. I felt like Michigan radio had our back, but other than that, not so much. But then everybody started piling on, and in some ways, like appropriating work that I had done without giving it credit, which would really have pissed me off if I was still at a newspaper. But you know, being at an advocacy organization, it's well, you know, as long as the information's getting out there, that's a deliverable in terms of my grant. So that's, you know, that's fine. Still pisses me off a little bit, but you know. Just because the unethical nature of doing that bothers me. But in any event, then the national media. What happened in November, December, a newly elected mayor, because the old mayor had said the water was safe, he got the boot. The newly elected mayor, emergency manager had left. The governor had said Flint's financial emergency is over. In April, just before the public health emergency became known, the new mayor declared a state of emergency, an actual emergency. And boy, things just went crazy. You know, first it was the Washington Post, and then it was media, big media from all over the country were calling to get background on the story. You know, I spent a lot of time explaining to reporters what was going on, and then they would go do their stories. And now, the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the U.S. Justice Department are conducting a criminal investigation. The Michigan State Attorney General is investigating. 5 people have resigned, including the regional director of the EPA, the head of the Department of Environmental Quality, and the guy that ensured people that their water is safe is out and in disgrace. Rightfully in disgrace. And the people of Flint, Mark Edwards had said at one point, you know, the biggest danger is not having lead in your water. The biggest danger is having lead in your water and not knowing about it. And as far as I was concerned, the day we held that press conference and that we announced what the conditions of the water really were was a victory. I felt like at that point that we had won. And to force the state to get back to the Detroit system was another victory. And now there is some momentum to either modify or repeal the emergency manager law. There's a lot of things happening around the issue. There's 2 things that are lessons from this, which is, you know, I'm getting invited to things like this now, but I was really just a part of the process, and the driving force of the process was the people of Flint who refused to believe the lie that their government was telling them that their water was safe. And if it wasn't for them, the world would not know about the lead disaster in Flint. The other thing is, you know, I just found out that I was not eligible for a Pulitzer because I didn't meet the requirements of working for an actual news organization. But I also just won the Michigan Journalist of the Year award. They didn't put any quotes around the word journalist on the award. And it is sort of valid. But in its own way, it validated what we were doing, and that was gratifying. But again, the most important thing, and I saw myself as an ally, working with Edwards, working with the citizens. I saw us as a team, and what we were doing, Edwards saw us as using me to help further his science. I saw Edwards and the citizens helping me further my investigation into what was going on with the water. But the people of Flint saw Edwards, me, and others as allies in their fight just to get clean, safe water. And they won. And you know, it's very heartening. At one point, we're in the basement of this church, and one of the people that we were working with, all these water sampling kits are around, and we're documenting it, making a documentary as we go along. And so, what are you doing here today? And she's here. We're going to get these sample kits out to the people, and we're going to find out the truth about what's in our water. And if there's any lasting message in this, it is how powerful the truth is. And it takes work to expose it, but that when you do that, amazing things could happen. And so this is very much a story about the power of truth, and journalism, whatever you want to call it, played a role in this. So that's it. Thank you, everybody.